Hello, everyone. For those of you who served, studied the conflict, or simply lived through that era, I have a question I've wrestled with for decades. When you're fighting an enemy who hides among the people, who becomes the people, where do you draw the line between protecting civilians and eliminating the threat? When does a line you swore you'd never cross become just another step on the path? The air that hit me when I stepped off the C-130 at Tan Son Nhut in May of '68 wasn't just hot. It was thick. A physical weight of jet fuel, charcoal smoke, and something else. Something vaguely sweet and rotting that I'd come to associate with the country itself. I was 26 years old, a fresh-faced case officer from the agency, filled with the righteous certainty of a man who'd read all the right books. I believed in the domino theory. I believed in the mission. And I believed, most of all, in the new strategy that had brought me here. A coordinated effort to dismantle the Viet Cong shadow government, the very political and administrative skeleton that allowed them to persist. It was called the Pong Hoang Program by the South Vietnamese, the Phoenix Program by us. The name was evocative, promising rebirth from the ashes of insurgency. It was meant to be the scalpel to the Marine Corps' sledgehammer, a precise, intelligence-driven campaign to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the VCI. We weren't after the trigger pullers in black pajamas. We were after the tax collectors, the propaganda chiefs, the village secretaries, the hidden political commissars who were the true heart of the enemy's power. My briefing in Langley had been clinical, all charts and statistics. William Colby himself had championed the idea: win the other war, the war for the loyalty of the Vietnamese peasant. It sounded clean. It sounded smart. It sounded, to my idealistic ears, like the only way to win without destroying the country we were trying to save. My posting was to a province in the Delta, a waterlogged maze of canals and rice paddies that was a traditional VC stronghold. As the smaller Caribou aircraft bucked and swayed on its final approach to the provincial airstrip, I looked down not at a jungle, but at a quilt of vibrant green, dotted with hamlets and the brown ribbons of countless waterways. From 1,000 feet, it looked peaceful. It was a lie. Down there, every village was its own small war, every farmer a potential sympathizer, every village chief a potential target. I was met at the airstrip by Major Frank Davis, a US Army advisor who'd been in country for 18 months and looked like he'd aged a decade for each one. His fatigues were faded to a pale olive, his face a roadmap of sun-etched lines and weariness. He didn't salute. He just grunted and motioned for me to throw my duffel in the back of his Jeep. "Welcome to the real world, spook," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Forget everything they taught you at the farm. Out here, there's only one rule: survive." The drive to the MACV compound was a sensory assault. The smells of nuoc mam, diesel exhaust, and unwashed humanity mingled in the humid air. Children in rags played in the dusty streets, stopping to stare with unnerving curiosity at the American Jeep. On a wall, a splash of red paint crudely depicted a fanged caricature of Uncle Sam being bayoneted. The war wasn't on some distant front. It was right here, scrawled on the walls, hidden in the eyes of the people we passed. At the compound, a drab collection of sandbagged buildings sweating under tin roofs, I was shown to my hooch and then taken to the nerve center of our operation. The District Intelligence and Operations Coordination Center, or DIOCC. It was a single, large room, buzzing with the frantic energy of a stock market floor. Maps covered every wall, bristling with pins of different colors. Vietnamese officers and NCOs huddled over desks piled high with paperwork, while American advisors like Davis moved between them, pointing at maps and speaking in a clipped mixture of English and broken Vietnamese. This was where the phoenix rose. Here, scraps of information, a captured document, an informant's tip, a prisoner's confession, were collated, cross-referenced and analyzed to build a file on a suspected member of the VCI. Once a file was complete and a target was identified and categorized, A for a key leader, B for a functionary, C for a low-level supporter. It was passed on to the action arm. That was usually the Provincial Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU, a group of trigger-happy Vietnamese paramilitaries on the CIA payroll, known for their brutality and effectiveness in equal measure. My job was to be the American linchpin, the man who vetted the intelligence, approved the files, and ensured the program ran as it was designed, as a targeted counter-insurgency tool, not a blunt instrument of terror. My counterpart, the man I would be working with most closely, was the provincial chief, a South Vietnamese army officer named Colonel Tran Van Loc. He was a small, immaculate man whose uniform was always perfectly pressed, even in the suffocating heat. He greeted me with a polished smile and a firm handshake, his eyes glittering with an intelligence that felt both sharp and predatory. "Mr. Riley," he said in precise French accented English, "it is an honor. We have much work to do. The communist cancer runs deep in this province. But with your resources and my knowledge of our people, we shall cut it out." He gestured to a large board on the wall. It had columns for captured, rallied, and killed. The numbers for the month were dismally low. I could feel the pressure from Saigon, from Washington, without him having to say a word. In my first week, I reviewed dozens of files. They were a mosaic of the shadow war. A woman accused of running a courier service for the local VC committee. A teacher suspected of indoctrinating his students with communist propaganda. A farmer believed to be collecting rice as a revolutionary tax. Much of the intelligence was thin, based on hearsay or a single, uncorroborated source. It was my job to separate the wheat from the chaff, to demand better sourcing, to ensure we weren't acting on bad information or worse, on personal grudges disguised as patriotism. I sent my first file back, demanding more evidence. It was for a man accused of being a VCI tax collector. The only source was his brother-in-law, with whom he was known to have a land dispute. Major Davis saw the rejected file on my desk. He picked it up, glanced at it, and tossed it back down. "Good luck with that," he grunted, lighting a cigarette. "Tran's not going to like you slowing down his numbers." To him, a dead VC is a dead VC. Doesn't much matter if he was a tax collector or just some poor bastard who owed the wrong guy money. I bristled at his cynicism. "My job is to make sure this program works as intended, Major. We're not an assassination squad. We're dismantling an infrastructure." He took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out in a slow, tired stream. "Kid, out here, the infrastructure is people, and people are messy. You'll learn." That night, lying under my mosquito net, listening to the distant crump of artillery, I thought about Colonel Tran's predatory smile and Major Davis's weary eyes. I thought about the files, the thin threads of accusation that could lead to a man's death. I still believed in the mission, but for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in. I was standing at the edge of a very dark and murky river, and I had just taken my first step in. The first real success came 2 weeks later, and it felt as clean and righteous as I had imagined. An agent I was running, a bartender in a local town named Bao, provided a tip. He'd overheard 2 men, regulars he knew to be sympathetic to the VC, talking about a clandestine meeting. The district propaganda chief, a man named Nguyen Van Heep, was coming to a nearby hamlet to deliver instructions and funds to the local cell. Hype was a Category A target, a major player in the province. His file was thick with evidence, captured letters bearing his signature, testimony from multiple defectors. He was responsible for a sophisticated campaign of anti-government leaflets and radio broadcasts that were eroding support for Saigon. Getting him would be a significant victory. I worked the case myself, poring over maps with my interpreter, a bright, serious young woman named Mai. We plotted the likely routes Heap might take, the layout of the hamlet, the location of the safehouse Bao had indicated. I insisted on a capture, not a kill. Heap's intelligence value was immense. He could give us the entire propaganda network for this sector of the Delta. Colonel Tran was skeptical. He is a snake, Mr. Riley. A dead snake cannot bite. But he eventually acquiesced to my plan, perhaps to humor the new American. Major Davis helped coordinate with the PRU team leader, a wiry, silent man with dead eyes who went only by the name Tiger. I briefed them myself, using Mai to translate, emphasizing the objective: Heap alive. The night of the operation was moonless and tense. I sat in the diok with Davis, the radio crackling with static. The minutes stretched into an eternity. We had no live feed, just the silence and our imaginations. I pictured a dozen things that could go wrong. An ambush, a firefight in the middle of a civilian hamlet, Heap slipping away into the darkness. Then, just after midnight, the radio sparked to life. Target acquired, in custody, moving to extraction point. A wave of relief washed over me that was so profound it left me lightheaded. Davis clapped me on the shoulder. "Nice one, Spook. You got your man." They brought Heap in just before dawn. He was smaller than I'd imagined, a thin man in his 50s with spectacles and the weary look of an academic. He wasn't a monster. He was an ideologue. The interrogation began immediately at the Provincial Interrogation Center, a grim concrete building on the edge of the compound. I was not allowed inside. That was strictly ARVN business. But I provided the list of questions. What I wanted were names, locations, methods. Within 48 hours, under methods I tried not to think about, Heap started talking, and he gave us everything. And the dam broke. Over the next month, acting on the intelligence from Heap's debriefing, we rolled up nearly 24 members of his network. We captured caches of printing presses, radios, and reams of propaganda materials. The flow of anti-government leaflets in the district slowed to a trickle. For the first time, we were on the offensive in the other war. It felt incredible. I received a commendatory cable from the station chief in Saigon. Colonel Tran treated me with a newfound respect, calling me his good luck charm. Even Davis offered a rare, grudging compliment. "Maybe that clean stuff works sometimes," he said over a warm beer at the makeshift officers' club. I allowed myself to believe that this was what Phoenix was supposed to be. We were surgeons, precisely excising the cancerous VCI cells, leaving the healthy tissue of the civilian population intact. We were winning hearts and minds by showing them that the government could protect them from the VC's shadow tyranny. My reports back to Langley were glowing. I detailed the successful operations, the value of precise, actionable intelligence, and the effectiveness of the DIOCC model. I was a true believer. But the war had a rhythm of its own, a relentless demand for progress that could not be satisfied by a single, spectacular success. The board in the DIOCC, with its columns for captured, rallied, and killed, was a hungry beast. The numbers for Heap's network boosted our monthly totals, but as soon as a new month began, the slate was wiped clean. The pressure from Saigon for results was constant. Quotas, though officially denied, were a reality. A province was judged by its numbers. A provincial chief's career depended on them, and my effectiveness, as the CIA advisor, was measured by the same brutal calculus. It was this pressure that began to subtly poison the well. Colonel Tran started forwarding files to me for approval that were thin, relying on a single source, often an anonymous letter. "This man is VC," he would say, tapping the folder. "I know it in my heart. My people know. We do not need a piece of paper to tell us who the enemy is." I'd push back, demanding corroboration. Sometimes he would provide it, sending his men out to find another villager to point the finger. Other times he would withdraw the file with a tight, frustrated smile, only for me to hear a week later that the man in the file had been killed in a chance encounter with a South Vietnamese patrol or had disappeared from his village. The lines began to blur. Was I preventing an injustice by rejecting the file? Or was I just delaying the inevitable and ensuring it happened outside the legitimate channels of the Phoenix program, with no oversight at all? Major Davis was no help. "It's Tran's country, his war," he'd say. "You're just a guest here. You think you can change the way things have been done for 1,000 years? He's fighting for his survival. You're fighting for a policy." The distinction stung because it was true. One afternoon, a file landed on my desk that made me physically uncomfortable. The target was a village chief named Man, a man well into his 60s. He was accused of being a VCI sympathizer, funneling supplies to a local VC unit. The primary source was a known racketeer in the province who had recently lost a lucrative contract to supply building materials to Man's village. The secondary source was a captured VC who, under interrogation, had mentioned Man's name, but the transcript showed he had been severely beaten and had named a dozen other people, half of whom were known to be staunchly pro-government. It was flimsy, and it stank of a personal vendetta. I rejected the file, writing a long memo explaining my reasoning. The next day, Colonel Tran requested a meeting. He didn't bring the file. He brought a bottle of expensive French brandy and 2 glasses. He spoke of the difficulties of his position, the untrustworthiness of his own people, the constant threat of assassination. He told me that this chief, Man, was playing a double game, placating the government by day and aiding the communists by night. "You Americans, you see things in black and white," he said, pouring the amber liquid. "Good, bad, innocent, guilty. Here, Mr. Riley, there is only gray. A man can be both a patriot and a traitor in the same day, depending on whose gun is to his head. But I know this man. He is weak, and in this war, weakness is a betrayal." He looked me straight in the eye, his polished veneer cracking for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of the ruthless survivor underneath. "Approve the file. Let my PRUs pay him a visit. It will send a message to the other chiefs in the area, a message of strength." I held his gaze, the brandy sitting untouched in my glass. The clean, righteous feeling of the heap capture felt a world away. This was something different. This was murky, personal, and potentially wrong. I was no longer a surgeon with a scalpel. I was being asked to be a gangster, to sanction a hit, to send a message. The choice was simple. Stick to my principles and risk alienating the one man whose cooperation was essential to the entire program in the province, or bend, just a little, in the name of pragmatism and the greater good of the war effort. That night, the distant artillery sounded less like a remote abstraction and more like a prelude. I held my ground on the file for the village chief, Man. For a week, an uncomfortable chill settled between me and Colonel Tran. He was polite, but formal. The easy rapport we had built was gone, My requests for information were met with slow, bureaucratic responses. The flow of intelligence into the DAOCC seemed to dry up. Major Davis pulled me aside. "You're cutting off your own nose to spite your face, Riley," he warned. "You need Tran. You think you can run this program without him? His people won't talk to you. They won't talk to your interpreter. They'll only talk to him and his men. You're pissing in the wind." He was right, and I knew it. The Phoenix program was a joint venture, and if one partner refused to cooperate, the entire enterprise would collapse. I was faced with a stark choice: maintain my integrity on a single, questionable case and render my entire mission ineffective, or compromise to keep the vital intelligence flowing. It was the classic dilemma of the war, a microcosm of the entire American effort. I finally relented. I didn't approve the original file, but I agreed to a compromise. Tran would produce another source, a defector from a neighboring district who would corroborate the accusation against Mang. It was a fiction, and we both knew it. A file would be created that looked legitimate on paper, a file I could sign off on without, in theory, violating the letter of the program's directives. The new source was produced within a day. A terrified-looking young man was brought in, and he dutifully recited the story Tran had likely coached him on. I signed the paperwork. I told myself it was a necessary evil, a tactical concession to achieve a strategic goal. But I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I had just knowingly sanctioned an operation based on a lie. A line had been crossed. 2 nights later, the PRU team went into Man's village. The official report, which I co-signed with Tran, stated that they had approached the chief's home to take him into custody for questioning. He had resisted, opening fire with an old pistol. The PRUs had returned fire, and he had been killed in the exchange. A search of his home, the report continued, had uncovered a small stash of medical supplies identical to those used by the VC. Case closed. Another VCI neutralized. A success for the Phoenix program. The monthly quota was met, but my interpreter, Mai, who had friends in that village, told me a different story. She told me the PRUs had not tried to arrest Mant. They had kicked in his door in the middle of the night, dragged the old man out of his bed, and shot him in front of his family. The pistol, she said, was planted. The medical supplies were nothing more than bandages and herbs for his arthritic wife. I confronted Tran with this. He didn't deny it. He simply shrugged. "His death has served its purpose," he said calmly. "The other village chiefs in the area are now much more cooperative. Sometimes, Mr. Riley, a symbol is more powerful than a man." I looked at him, at his calm, rational explanation for what I saw as cold-blooded murder, and I felt like I was looking at a creature from another planet. The chasm between my Langley, bred view of the world and the reality of this place had become an unbridgeable canyon, and I was on the wrong side of it. That event was the turning point. The clean successes like the Hiep capture became the rare exception. The norm became a grim parade of files like Man's. Phoenix, in Tran's hands, was morphing from an intelligence-gathering program into an instrument of terror and control. It was used to eliminate not just genuine VCI, but personal enemies, business rivals, and anyone who failed to show the proper deference to the provincial chief's authority. The system itself was ripe for this kind of abuse. An accusation was all it took. A name in a file, and the PRUs, paid a bounty for each VCI neutralized, had little incentive to bring people in alive. A dead man can't deny the charges. My role shifted from being a check on this system to being its unwilling facilitator. I was the American stamp of approval, the bureaucratic cog that gave the whole bloody machine a veneer of legitimacy. I would argue with Tran, demand more proof, delay the paperwork, but in the end, the pressure from him, and from my own superiors in Saigon who wanted to see results, was too great. I would sign, and another name would be passed to the PRUs. I began drinking more heavily, spending long nights at the officers' club with Major Davis, trying to drown the faces of the men in the files. Davis was a grim comfort. He never judged. He would just pour another drink and tell stories of other wars, other places where the lines had been just as blurry. "You think this is new?" he once slurred, gesturing around the smoky room. "We did this to the Indians. We did it in the Philippines. Every empire does it. You try to rule a people who don't want you. You can't be nice about it. You got to find the guys who are willing to do the dirty work, your local boys, and you let them off the leash. That's Tran. He's our son of a bitch. And your job, my friend, is to hold the leash, but not too tight." The cynicism that had once offended me now seemed like the only sane response to the madness. My idealism was a corpse, and I was just trying to find a way to live with the smell. The work took a psychological toll that was impossible to describe in my reports home. I became paranoid, seeing potential threats everywhere. The friendly smiles of the villagers now looked like masks. Was the woman selling fruit on the corner a spotter? Was the boy cleaning my boots listening to my conversations? The very people we were supposed to be winning over became a source of constant, low-grade fear. I was living inside the logic of the Phoenix program. Everyone was a potential suspect. My relationship with my interpreter, crumbled. She had once looked at me with respect, believing I represented a better, more just America. Now she looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. She would translate my words and trans words with a flat, emotionless voice, her eyes averted. She was a constant, silent accusation. One day, after a particularly gruesome report of a PRU operation came across my desk, one that involved the accidental deaths of 2 children during the neutralization of a female VCI suspect, I asked her what her people really thought of the Fung Huang program. She was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the dusty compound. Finally, she looked at me and her voice was barely a whisper. "You say you are burning away the forest to find the tiger," she said, "but you are just leaving us with ashes, and the tigers are still here." The descent accelerated. It was no longer a slope. It was a cliff. The machinery we had created, the system of identification, targeting, and neutralization, had taken on a life of its own. It was a beast that demanded to be fed, and its food was human lives. My protests became weaker, my compromises more frequent. I was trapped. To blow the whistle would mean ending my career and, more importantly, admitting that the entire strategy I had so fervently believed in was not just flawed, but fundamentally corrupting. So I played my part. I became an expert at sanitizing reports, at using the passive bureaucratic language that distanced me from the reality of what was happening. The subject offered resistance and was neutralized during the apprehension process. Collateral damage was incurred due to the subject's decision to locate his base of operations within a civilian dwelling. These phrases were my shield, my pathetic attempt to maintain a shred of self-respect. I was a bookkeeper for an abattoir. The Provincial Interrogation Center, the PIC, became a place I actively avoided. In the early days, I had pushed for access, for oversight. I had been politely but firmly rebuffed by Colonel Tran, who insisted it was a purely ARVN matter. But I knew what went on in there. You could hear it sometimes, late at night, if the wind was blowing from the right direction. A muffled scream that the generators couldn't quite drown out. The prisoners who went in rarely came out the same. Some were broken and became informants. Others were sent to the notorious Konsan Island prison. Many simply disappeared. their status logged as escaped or transferred to national police. Major Davis had a term for it. He called it going down the rabbit hole. One day, a PRU team brought in a young woman, barely 20. The file claimed she was a high-level courier for the district committee, a Category B target. The intelligence came from a single source, a captured VCI officer who was currently being debriefed in the PIC. I reviewed the source's file. He had been captured a week earlier and had not said a word for 5 days. Then suddenly he had started talking, giving up names, dates and locations with startling clarity. The name of this young woman was at the top of the list. I knew, with a certainty that chilled my soul, what had happened in that 5-day gap. I knew the information had been tortured out of him. The file on the woman was now on my desk, waiting for my signature to approve her disposition. Colonel Tran wanted her sent to the PIC for her own debriefing. He claimed she knew the location of a major arms cache. "She is a key, Mr. Riley," he told me, his voice smooth as silk. "We must turn her." I looked at the photo attached to her file. She was staring into the camera with defiant eyes, a small cut on her lip. She looked like a student, not a hardened revolutionary. I imagined her inside the PIC in the hands of Tran's interrogators. The thought made me physically ill. For the first time in months, something inside me snapped. "No," I said. Tran raised an eyebrow. "No? What do you mean, no?" "I'm not signing it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The intelligence is tainted. It was obtained under duress. It's inadmissible. We have no corroborating evidence." Tran's smile vanished. "This is not a courtroom, Mr. Riley. This is a war. Your sentimentality is a luxury we cannot afford. There are rules, Colonel. Even in war. Rules of engagement. The Geneva Conventions." He let out a short, sharp laugh. "The men we are fighting burn villages and execute school teachers. They strap bombs to children. You want to talk to me about the Geneva Conventions? You are a guest in my country. Do not lecture me on how to defend it." He stood up, his small frame radiating menace. "You will sign the paper, or I will go to your superiors in Saigon. I will tell them that their man in this province is obstructing the Penghuang program, that he is soft on the communists. How do you think that will look on your record?" He left the file on my desk and walked out. I sat there for a long time, the fan turning slowly overhead, doing nothing to cut the oppressive heat. I was cornered. He had me and he knew it. If I refused, he would ruin me. I would be recalled in disgrace, my career over. If I signed, I would be sending that woman to a place that was the very definition of hell on earth. I was damned either way. I picked up the file and stared at the young woman's face. Her defiant eyes seemed to be looking right at me, judging me. I thought of my younger self, the man who had arrived in this country with such certainty and purpose. What would he think of the man I had become? Major Davis found me a few hours later staring at the same file. I hadn't moved. "Tran's in a rage," he said, slumping into a chair. "Told me you've gone native, but not in the good way. What's this all about?" I pushed the file across the desk. He glanced at it. "Ah, the girl. Yeah, it's a messy one. Source is probably garbage." "I can't sign it, Frank," I said, my voice hoarse. "I just can't." He was quiet for a minute, studying my face. "You know what happens if you don't, right? Tran will get his way eventually. He'll just bypass you. Go through different channels. The girl ends up in the PIC anyway. The only difference is, you'll be on a plane home with your career in ashes, and the guy they send to replace you? He'll be some hard charger who signs anything Tran puts in front of him without a second thought. Is that a better outcome?" His logic was a cold, hard prison. He was telling me that my personal moral stand was not only futile but counterproductive. It was better to stay, to be the compromised gear in the machine, than to be no gear at all. Because at least if I stayed, I might, on a good day, be able to stop the worst of the abuses. It was the devil's bargain, the ultimate rationalization of a man who has lost his way. So what do? I asked, the question hanging in the dead air between us. He leaned forward, his voice low. You sign the paper, Jack. Then you go to the club, and I'll buy you a drink. And then another. And tomorrow, we get up and we do it all over again. That's all there is. That's the whole damn war. I picked up my pen. The ink felt like acid as it flowed onto the page. I signed my name. And as I did, I felt something inside me die. It wasn't a dramatic death, just a quiet final extinguishing of a small flame I hadn't even realized was still flickering. I was now truly a part of the Phoenix program, not just its administrator. I was one of its ghosts. The act of signing the young woman's transfer order was an abdication. I had chosen the path of least resistance, the path of self-preservation, and in doing so, I had become fully complicit. The days that followed were a blur of routine and self-loathing. I processed paperwork, analyzed intelligence that I knew was suspect, and co-signed after-action reports that were masterpieces of fiction. I was a functioning part of the machine, efficient and dead inside. My relationship with Major Davis changed. The shared act of cynicism had forged a strange bond between us. We spent most evenings at the club, drinking ourselves into a state of numb oblivion. Our conversations were no longer about winning the war, but about surviving it. We talked about home, about baseball, about anything other than the work we were doing just a few hundred yards away. It was a conspiracy of silence. But you can't outrun your own conscience, no matter how much whiskey you pour on it. The woman's face, from her file photo, haunted me. I started having nightmares, not of combat, but of quiet rooms and paperwork. In my dreams, I would be signing my name over and over again on an endless stack of files, and with each signature, the room would get darker, the air colder. I knew I had to do something, but the inertia of the system and my own fear held me in place. The breaking point came in the form of a hamlet called An Loc. It was a small, poor fishing village on the bank of a tributary of the Mekong, a place that had largely been left alone by both sides of the war. It was too insignificant to be a strategic prize. But Colonel Tran developed an obsession with it. His intelligence network, which by now I knew was little more than a collection of paid gossips and thugs, had identified An Loc as a rest and recuperation center for a mainline VC battalion. The intel was, as usual, thin. It was based on the testimony of a single informant, a man who had been caught smuggling contraband and was now trying to buy his way out of trouble by giving Tran what he wanted to hear. Tran drew up a plan for a major operation. It wasn't the usual small PRU snatch and grab. He wanted to surround the entire hamlet at dawn with 2 companies of ARVN regulars, supported by the PRUs and American helicopter gunships, which Major Davis and I would have to request. The plan was to sweep through the village and eliminate all hostile elements. It was a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and I was convinced the nut wasn't even there. "Colonel, this is insane," I argued in a planning meeting. "The evidence is weak. You're going to go in that heavy, you'll level the village. You'll kill civilians. This is not Phoenix. This is a conventional assault on a non-existent target." Tran was unmoved. "The informant is credible," he stated flatly, though he couldn't meet my eyes. "The VCI in that hamlet are deep. They have bunkers. We must be decisive. Davis, to my surprise, backed me up. Riley's right, Colonel. My choppers aren't for terrorizing fishermen. You want American air support? You give me concrete proof of a significant enemy presence. I want coordinates of bunkers, signals intelligence, something I can hang my hat on. All you've got is the word of one scumbag. The alliance was unexpected, but welcome. For a moment, I thought we had him, but Tran was more cunning than I gave him credit for. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, packed up his maps and said, "Very well, I will proceed with the assets available to me." He was going to do it anyway, with or without our approval or support. He would use his ARVN troops and his PRUs. It would be his operation, and if it went wrong, the blame would be his. But I knew that wasn't enough. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. That night, I did something I had never done before. I took a jeep, and with Mai as my reluctant interpreter and guide, I drove out towards An Loc. It was a stupid, reckless risk. We traveled without an escort, on roads that were notoriously unsafe after dark. Mai was terrified, and I couldn't blame her. I told her I just needed to see the place, to talk to someone, anyone. We stopped at a roadside stall a few kilometers from the village. Pretending to be lost, I struck up a conversation with the old man running it. Mai translated, her voice trembling. I asked about the village. Were there soldiers there? Strangers? The old man shook his head. It was a quiet place, he said. Poor. No one bothered with them. He hadn't seen a Viet Cong in years. He was more afraid of the government soldiers who stole his chickens. It was what I had suspected. Tran wasn't targeting the VC, he was targeting the village itself. But why? When we got back to the compound, I asked Mai. She was hesitant to speak, afraid of the consequences. But I pressed her, assuring her she would be protected. Finally, she told me. An Loc was on land that a wealthy Saigon businessman, a cousin of Colonel Tran, wanted to acquire for a new shipping depot. The villagers had refused to sell. The VCI infestation was a pretext, a way to clear the land by force, sanctioned by the fog of war. The Phoenix program, our sophisticated counterinsurgency tool, was being used as a real estate broker's enforcer. The sheer, naked corruption of it finally shattered my apathy. This wasn't about a blurry line between combatant and civilian anymore. This was a crime. I went straight to the communications hooch. I had a secure teletype link to the CIA station in Saigon. Bypassing my immediate chain of command, bypassing Davis and everyone else, I sent a flash message directly to the station chief. I laid out everything: the flimsy intelligence, my own reconnaissance, the story about the land deal. I described Tran's planned operation and requested immediate intervention to halt it. I called it what it was, a planned atrocity for personal gain, using the Phoenix program as cover. I knew the risk I was taking. I was accusing a key Allied officer of massive corruption. I was implicitly criticizing my own superiors for letting him get away with it for so long. I was ending my career, one way or another. But as I typed, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I was finally crossing a line, but this time, I was crossing it back in the right direction. I hit the send key and waited. The response, when it came an hour later, was 3 words long. Stand by. Await instructions. I had thrown a grenade into the heart of the machine. Now I had to wait and see if it would explode in my hand or in theirs. The waiting was the worst part. For 48 hours, the world seemed to hold its breath. I was a dead man walking around the compound. Colonel Tran knew I had done something. The sudden halt on all of my requests for information and the icy glares he shot me across the DIOCC were proof enough. Major Davis was caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to a fellow American and his pragmatic need to maintain a working relationship with Tran. He avoided me, which was probably for the best. I spent the time in my hooch, methodically packing my things, half expecting MPs to show up at my door at any moment. I wrote a long, detailed letter to my father, a history professor back in Ohio, trying to explain the labyrinth I had stumbled into. I couldn't send it, of course. It was full of classified information, but the act of writing it was a confession, a way to organize the chaos in my own mind. I wrote about the idealism, the slow corruption, the file on the young woman, the village of An Loc. I admitted that I had failed, not as a spy, but as a man. The instructions finally came via a coded cable delivered by a tight-lipped communications sergeant. I was to be at the provincial airstrip at 0600 the next morning. A helicopter would be there to transport me to Saigon for an urgent consultation. The cable was signed by the station chief himself. There was no mention of Colonel Tran or the An Loc operation. It was a recall, plain and simple. I had been deemed a problem, and the solution was to remove me. As I walked to the airstrip in the pre-dawn gloom, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the compound was still quiet. The air was cool for a change. I passed the DAOCC, its windows dark. I passed the officers' club, empty and stale. I passed the grim concrete block of the provincial interrogation center. I was leaving, but the place, the system, would remain. A new, more pliable case officer would arrive to take my place. The numbers on the board would continue to climb. The machine would keep running. Major Davis was waiting for me by the helipad, leaning against his jeep. He looked tired, older than he had just a few days ago. "So, you did it," he said, not as a question. "You pulled the pin." "I didn't have a choice, Frank," I said. "He was going to wipe out a village for a land deal." "I know," he said, and for the first time I saw something other than cynicism in his eyes. It looked like shame. "I should have backed you up more. I've been here too long. You start to think this is the only way things can be." He handed me a sealed envelope. "The station chief sent a message for Tran. I'm to deliver it after you're gone. My guess? It's a slap on the wrist. They'll cancel the big operation, but he'll keep his job. He's too valuable. They'll find another way to get that land. They always do." So that was it. I hadn't stopped the crime. I had just complicated it. I had saved the village of An Loc for now, but Tran would remain in power, his corruption untouched. The only real consequence of my moral stand was my own removal. The system protected itself. The helicopter, a Huey, descended with a deafening roar, kicking up a storm of red dust. As I prepared to board, my interpreter, appeared at the edge of the helipad. I hadn't seen her since our reckless trip to An Loc. She stepped forward and, to my surprise, handed me a small, clumsily wrapped parcel. "For your journey," she said, her voice quiet. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I boarded the helicopter, and as it lifted off the ground, I looked down at the McEvy compound, a tiny sandbagged island in a sea of green. I saw Davis standing by his jeep, a lonely figure getting smaller and smaller. The province, the whole country, spread out beneath me. From this height, it looked beautiful again, peaceful, a lie. I opened the parcel Mai had given me. Inside was a small carved wooden bird, a phoenix. I didn't know if it was a gesture of thanks, an accusation, or simply a reminder of the program that had brought me here and chewed me up. I clutched it in my hand as the helicopter banked south toward Saigon. The meeting at the station was brief and brutal. The chief, a patrician man in a crisp civilian suit, didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told me I had shown poor judgment. I had violated the chain of command. I had endangered a critical relationship with an allied partner. I had, in his words, failed to grasp the complexities of the operational environment. I was being sent home. My career in the clandestine service was over. There was no discussion, no chance to defend myself. I was a broken tool, and the agency was discarding me. I spent one last night in Saigon, a city of frantic, hedonistic energy, a city dancing on the edge of its own grave. I felt like a ghost, invisible to the soldiers, contractors, and journalists who crowded the bars of Tudu Street. I was already gone. The flight back to the United States was 20 hours of purgatory. I sat staring out the window at the Pacific Ocean, the wooden phoenix heavy in my pocket. I had gone to Vietnam to fight an enemy, but the real war had been fought inside myself, and I had lost. I had crossed lines I never thought I would cross. And the one time I had tried to stand my ground, I had been swatted away like an insect. I had tried to be a surgeon and had become a butcher's assistant. What had the Phoenix program accomplished? I had no easy answer. I had seen it work, as with the capture of Hiep, the propaganda chief. It undoubtedly degraded the VCI's ability to operate in many areas. It sowed paranoia and distrust within their ranks. The numbers, the brutal statistics that had driven me to despair, did represent a real impact on the enemy's command and control. But at what cost? The program became a catch-all for the war's darkest impulses. It gave official sanction to assassination, torture, and corruption. It armed and paid men who used their new power to settle old scores and enrich themselves. It created a shadow war so murky that justice became an irrelevant concept. For every genuine VCI agent we neutralized, how many innocent people like the village chief, Mang, were murdered? How many women like the one in the file were swallowed by the interrogation centers? How many villages like An Loc were targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with the war? These were the questions that would follow me home, the ghosts that would sit with me in the quiet of a suburban American night, years after the last helicopter lifted off the roof of the embassy in Saigon. The war ended, but for those of us who were part of Phoenix, it never really did. We just brought it home with us. I landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, stepping out of the humid, contained world of the military transport and into the cool, indifferent air of home. The America I returned to in late 1969 was not the one I had left. It was a nation tearing itself apart over the very war I had just been ejected from. The righteous certainty that had propelled me to Vietnam seemed like a naive relic from another age. I was 27 years old, but I felt ancient. My debriefing at Langley was a sterile, bureaucratic affair. I was handled by men in the personnel department, not the operations directorate. They were polite, efficient, and utterly uninterested in my experiences or my warnings about Colonel Tran. My file was stamped with a vaguely damning assessment, not suited for the pressures of field command. I was given a choice, a permanent desk job analyzing satellite photos of Soviet grain harvests, or an honorable discharge. I took the discharge. I couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of my life in those quiet, air-conditioned rooms, knowing what I knew. I tried to readjust. I moved back to Ohio, enrolled in graduate school using the GI Bill, and tried to melt back into the life I had left behind. But the war had rewired me. I couldn't sit in a lecture hall and listen to abstract theories about political science without thinking of Colonel Tran's predatory smile. I couldn't look at a map without seeing the canals and rice paddies of the Delta. I was haunted by the ghosts of my own decisions. The file on the young woman, the report on Chief Man, my signature on dozens of documents that had condemned people to the PIC or to a shallow grave. I suffered from what we now call moral injury, the wound that comes not from what was done to you, but from what you yourself have done. There was no parade for veterans like me. For those who fought in the shadows, there was only silence. I couldn't talk about what I had seen or done. It was classified, for one thing. But more than that, who would understand? How could I explain the logic of the Phoenix program to people who saw the war in simple terms of good and evil, hawk and dove? How could I explain that I had been part of something that was both a strategically sound counter-insurgency tactic and a monstrous engine of atrocity, often at the same time? I followed the news of the war with a morbid obsession. I read about the continued expansion of the Phoenix program. By the early 1970s, the official numbers were staggering. Over 20,000 VCI killed, 30,000 captured, 20,000 rallied to the government side. The program's proponents, like William Colby, who eventually became director of the CIA, defended it to Congress as a vital and successful component of the war effort. They claimed it was a key reason the VC were unable to mount another offensive on the scale of Tet in '68. They were probably right. From a purely military perspective, Phoenix worked. It decapitated the insurgency's leadership, crippled its administration, and created a climate of fear that made it impossible for the VCI to operate with impunity. It was one of the few American strategies in Vietnam that could be argued, on paper, as a success. But I knew the reality behind those numbers. I knew how many of those killed were civilians caught in the crossfire or victims of personal vendettas. I knew how many of those captured were tortured into false confessions. I knew the system was designed to generate statistics, and that the pressure for those statistics inevitably corrupted the process. I thought often of Major Davis and his cynical wisdom. He had understood the devil's bargain from the start. He knew that to fight a war like the one in Vietnam, America had to empower men like Colonel Tran. We had to unleash forces we couldn't fully control. We had to accept a level of brutality and corruption that was antithetical to the very values we claimed to be defending. Davis had found a way to live with it. I hadn't. I lost track of the people I had known. I never knew what happened to the young woman I had sent to the Pixie. I never knew if the village of An Loc was eventually bulldozed for Tran's cousin. I never knew what became of my interpreter, whose quiet disappointment was a more damning judgment than any official reprimand. They were all ghosts, swept away by the storm. Years later, after the fall of Saigon, I saw a picture in a news magazine of South Vietnamese officers being led away to re-education camps by the victorious North Vietnamese. I scanned their faces, looking for the familiar, immaculate features of Colonel Tran. I never found him. I imagined he was one of the lucky ones, one who had used his wealth and connections to get himself and his family out, perhaps to Paris or California, to live out his days in comfortable exile. The war had been very good to men like him. I eventually found a measure of peace, or at least a quiet armistice with my past. I became a high school history teacher in a small town. I tried to teach my students about the complexities of war, about the gray areas where there are no easy answers. I kept the small wooden phoenix Mai had given me in a drawer with old photographs and medals. Sometimes late at night, I would take it out and hold it. It was a reminder of my own rebirth from the ashes of my idealism. I had gone to Vietnam as a boy who believed in black and white, and had returned as a man who knew the world was composed of nothing but shades of gray. The ultimate question of the Phoenix program, was it worth it, is one history cannot definitively answer. It was a success if you measure success by the number of enemies eliminated. It was a catastrophic failure if you measure it by the moral cost to both the Vietnamese people and to America itself. It was a program that showed how a nation, even one founded on principles of justice and liberty, could, in the crucible of a desperate war, adopt the very methods of the tyranny it was fighting. It demonstrated that when you stare into the abyss for long enough, the abyss stares back. And sometimes, it wins. The line I had wondered about when I first arrived, the one I swore I would never cross, turned out not to be a line at all. It was a door, and once you walk through it, you can never truly go back. The years smoothed over the sharpest edges of the memories, but they never disappeared. They became a part of my internal landscape, like old mountains, always present on the horizon. I married, had children, and built a life that was as deliberately normal and quiet as my time in Vietnam had been chaotic and violent. I was Mr. Riley, the history teacher who was a bit too passionate about the Cold War, the guy who sometimes stared off into the middle distance during school assemblies. My students knew I was a veteran, but I was one of thousands in our small Ohio town. The specific nature of my service remained locked away, a private burden. The public reckoning with the Vietnam War, when it finally came, was a messy and unsatisfying affair. The debates focused on the big picture, the lies of the Johnson administration, the futility of the bombing campaigns, the tragedy of Kent State. The Phoenix program was occasionally mentioned, usually in congressional hearings or expose articles, where it was depicted as a rogue CIA assassination ring. That description, while containing a kernel of truth, was too simple. It missed the bureaucratic, systematic nature of the program, the way it drew in not just ruthless killers, but also ordinary, well-intentioned people like the man I had once been. It missed the way the program's logic could turn a noble goal, protecting civilians from a shadow government, into a justification for terror. It was never just about assassination. It was about information, control, and the corrosive effect of quotas. The program was a bureaucracy of death, and its most terrifying aspect was its sheer banality. The files, the reports, the color-coded pins on the map, they all served to distance the decision-makers from the blood and fear on the ground. I could sign a paper in an air-conditioned room, and half a country away, a family's life would be shattered. That was the true horror of Phoenix. It made murder a clerical task. I sometimes wondered if I would have been better off as a grunt, a regular infantryman. The trauma of combat is immense, but it is, in some ways, cleaner. You fight an enemy you can see. The moral choices are stark and immediate. There is no time for the slow, creeping corruption of the soul that came with my work. My wounds were invisible, carried not in my body but in my memory. They were the faces of the people whose files I had signed, the sound of my interpreter's disappointed voice, the weight of the wooden phoenix in my pocket. In the 1990s, with the opening of archives and the declassification of documents, a new wave of historians began to re-examine the war. More nuanced and detailed accounts of the Phoenix program emerged. They acknowledged its strategic effectiveness while also meticulously documenting its abuses. Reading these books was a strange experience. It was like seeing an autopsy report of a part of your own life. The names of the programs, the acronyms, the locations, they were all there, laid out in cold academic prose. It was all real. It had all happened. One book contained a brief mention of my old province. It detailed how, after a period of success in dismantling the local VCI network, the program had become notorious for its corruption under the leadership of a particularly ruthless provincial chief. The book mentioned an incident where an American advisor had attempted to blow the whistle on a planned operation against a civilian village and had been abruptly recalled. There was no name, just an American advisor. Reading those words, I felt a strange sense of vindication and futility. My small act of rebellion had become a footnote in a history book. My story, my crisis of conscience, was a single, anonymous data point in a vast and tragic equation. What became of the others? I imagined Major Frank Davis finishing his tour and then another, a professional soldier doing his duty as he saw it, his cynicism a shield that allowed him to function in a world devoid of clear moral signposts. He was a survivor. I hoped he had made it home, found some peace, and was able to leave the ghosts behind in a way that I never could. And Colonel Tran? I pictured him thriving, a man perfectly adapted to a world where power is the only currency that matters. Whether in Saigon, Paris, or Los Angeles, he would have found a way to profit, to land on his feet. The war was not a tragedy for him. It was an opportunity. Men like Tran don't have ghosts. They create them. My greatest regret, the one that still surfaces on quiet nights, is Mai. She represented the true victim of the war, the ordinary Vietnamese person, caught between two brutal ideologies trying to maintain their dignity and humanity in a world determined to strip it from them. I had come to her country to save it, but my presence and the program I represented had only deepened her people's suffering. My final act, my protest against the Anlock operation, was done partly to save my own soul, but I hoped it had also, in some small way, honored the trust she had initially placed in me. The wooden phoenix she gave me was the only tangible thing I had left from that time. It wasn't a symbol of rebirth for me, not in the triumphant way the program's name intended. It was a symbol of being burned down to your essential self and having to see if there was anything left to rebuild. It represented the loss of innocence, not just for me, but for my country. We had gone into Vietnam with a sense of our own righteousness and power, and had emerged humbled, divided, and stained by the things we had done in the name of victory. We had tried to kill the tiger in the jungle, but we had ended up setting the jungle on fire, and in the process, we had burned a part of our own soul. The line between protecting a people and destroying them, the one I had so confidently thought I could navigate, is not drawn in the sand. It is a razor's edge. And when you are balanced upon it, the only way to go is down. As I grew older and the war receded further into the past, becoming a subject for my students rather than a lived reality, my perspective continued to shift. The intense, personal guilt began to fade, replaced by a more profound and weary sadness. I started to see the Phoenix program not just as a personal failing or a military strategy, but as an inevitable outcome of a certain kind of thinking, the detached, systems-oriented mindset of the Cold War. We in the agency, the military planners, the whiz kids in the Pentagon, we saw the world as a grand chessboard. Vietnam wasn't a country, it was a square on the board. The people weren't people, they were assets, threats, targets, or collateral damage. We created a system, Phoenix, that was logical and elegant on paper. It broke down a complex human insurgency into manageable data points. It created flowcharts and metrics for success. The problem was that life and war is not a system. It is a messy, unpredictable, and deeply human affair. Our program, in its quest for clinical efficiency, stripped the humanity out of the equation. It turned suspicion into a death sentence and neighborhood disputes into counterterrorism operations. It couldn't distinguish between a dedicated communist cadre and a farmer who gave a bag of rice to his nephew who happened to be with the VC. To the system, they were both supporters, both nails to be hammered down. Colonel Tran was not an aberration of the system. He was its most perfect expression. He understood its true nature and used it to its full potential. He didn't care about ideology or hearts and minds. He cared about power, and Phoenix was the most powerful tool he had ever been given. It allowed him to eliminate his enemies with the full backing and funding of the most powerful nation on Earth. We thought he was working for us, but in reality, we were working for him. We were the well-intentioned, naive foreigners who provided the guns, the money, and the veneer of legitimacy for his own brutal consolidation of power. This realization did not absolve me of my own choices. I still had to live with the signatures I had put on those files, but it placed my experience within a larger, more tragic context. I was a small cog in a vast machine that had been designed with a fatal flaw. It had no soul. It was a machine built to count bodies, not to weigh consciences. My children grew up and asked me about the war. I found that I could talk about it more easily with them than I ever could with their mother or with my own generation. They had no preconceived notions, no political baggage. To them, it was just history. I told them a sanitized version, of course. I spoke of the heat, the confusion, the difficulty of knowing who the enemy was. I never told them about the PC, or about the file on the young woman, or about the true reason for the unlock operation. Some things are not meant to be passed down. But I tried to convey the central lesson I had learned. I told them that the most dangerous people in the world are not necessarily the evil ones, but the certain ones. The ones who believe so strongly in their own righteousness that they are willing to do anything to achieve their goals. I told them that systems and ideologies are dangerous because they can blind you to the humanity of the person standing in front of you. I told them that in any conflict, the first casualty is not truth, but complexity. In my last year of teaching before I retired, a student gave a presentation on the Vietnam War. He was a bright kid, and he had done his research. He talked about the Phoenix program, using the standard description of it as a controversial CIA assassination program. He quoted the official statistics of VCI neutralized. He showed the famous picture of the Saigon police chief executing a captive on a city street during the Tet Offensive, presenting it as the epitome of the war's brutality. After his presentation, he asked if I had any comments. The whole class looked at me, this relic from the era they were studying. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I looked at the faces of these young, hopeful kids, so full of the kind of certainty I had once possessed. That picture, I said, pointing to the slide, is horrifying, but it's also honest. It's a man killing another man face to face. It's brutal, but it's clear. The real danger, the thing you should be more afraid of, is the killing that happens without a picture. The killing that happens with a signature on a piece of paper in a quiet office 100 miles away. The killing that gets logged as a statistic in a program that looks efficient and successful on a chart in a briefing room in Washington. I paused. The classroom silent. That's the part of war you don't see. It's the part that allows good people to do terrible things and still sleep at night. It's the part that turns human beings into numbers. Never forget that. Whatever you do in your lives, never let yourselves become so focused on the system that you forget the people within it. I don't know if they understood. But for me, in that moment, I felt like I had finally found the words to describe the ghost that had haunted me for 30 years. I had given it a name. The war is long over. The country is unified under the very government we fought so hard to defeat. The dominoes never fell. The world moved on. But for those of us who were there, a part of us will always be in that maze of rice paddies and canals, caught in the twilight of a war where there were no clear victories, no simple truths, and no clean hands. The Phoenix, in the end, did not bring rebirth. It simply taught us that some ashes are so toxic, nothing can ever grow there again. Now decades removed from the suffocating humidity and constant low-grade fear of the Delta, the war comes to me in flashes, like fragments of a dream. The taste of stale, chlorinated water, the whir of a ceiling fan in a silent room, the sight of a child's sandal lying in a dusty road. These small sensory details have more power to transport me back than any photograph or history book. They are the shrapnel still embedded in my memory. The world has forgotten the specifics of the Phoenix program. It has been subsumed into the larger, simpler narrative of the Vietnam War, a tragic, ill-conceived adventure. But I remember. I remember the theory, the promise of a smarter, more precise way to fight an insurgency. And I remember the practice, the slow, sickening corruption of that ideal. The fundamental flaw was one of imagination. We, the Americans, could not imagine the depth of the Vietnamese people's desire for national reunification, even under a communist banner. We saw it as a simple Cold War proxy battle, a contest between our model and theirs. We failed to understand that we were interlopers in a civil war that had been raging for generations. And because we could not imagine their perspective, we could not understand their resilience. We thought that by eliminating the VCI, the fish, the water would become clear and placid. We failed to realize that the fish and the water were, in many ways, the same thing. The VCI was not an alien infrastructure imposed upon the people. It was an organic part of the village community. The tax collector might also be your cousin. The propaganda chief might be the village elder. By targeting them, we were not just fighting an enemy. We were tearing apart the very fabric of rural society. This is a truth that no chart in a Langley briefing room could ever capture. The program's legacy is not in the statistics of its neutralizations, but in the deep scars it left on the Vietnamese people and on the American psyche. For the Vietnamese, it created a legacy of paranoia and betrayal that lasted long after the war was over. When anyone could be an informant and any personal dispute could be weaponized into a VCI accusation, trust evaporates. It poisoned communities from within, a more insidious and lasting damage than any bomb or bullet. For America, Phoenix was a dark milestone. It was the institutionalization of practices that we had, until then, largely kept in the shadows. It was a step toward the kind of warfare that would become more common in the decades to follow, data-driven, reliant on special forces, and operating in a legal and moral gray zone. It was a program that asked men like me to sacrifice not our lives, but our principles for the sake of national security. And it taught the government a dangerous lesson, that such programs, if kept sufficiently secret and wrapped in bureaucratic language, could be carried out with minimal public outcry. I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I had not gone to Vietnam, if I had stayed in Ohio and become a lawyer or a businessman. I would be a different person, undoubtedly, perhaps a happier one, but I would not understand the things I now understand. I would not know the fragility of morality, the seductive power of certainty, or the ease with which good intentions can pave a road to hell. My time in the Phoenix program was a brutal education, but it was an education nonetheless. I learned that patriotism is not enough. I learned that orders are not a substitute for a conscience. And I learned that the most difficult enemy to fight is the one that looks back at you from the mirror. I am an old man now. My children are grown, with children of their own. My little town in Ohio is quiet and peaceful. The war is a distant echo. But every now and then I take out the small wooden phoenix. I run my thumb over its carved wings. It is smooth and worn from decades of handling. It does not feel like a symbol of victory or defeat. It feels like a key to a locked room in my past, a room full of ghosts and difficult questions. The question I started with, "Where do you draw the line?" is one I can now answer. The line is drawn not on a map or in a rule book, but within yourself. It is a line of empathy. The moment you stop seeing the people you are fighting, or ruling, or pacifying as human beings, with families and histories and hopes and fears of their own, you have crossed it. The moment they become mere targets, statistics, or obstacles, you have lost the war, no matter how many battles you win. I crossed that line in Vietnam.